Welcome to Lecture 3. As you'll see in this and the next lecture, winemakers have almost a mystical connection to their grapes, their land, and their wine. In this lecture, we'll start out by learning about what happens in the vineyards all the way up to just before harvest. You'll need the following wines for this lecture. We have it here, a Chablis AC, as you saw in the last lecture, and a South Australian Chardonnay. We'll be looking at these elements, how they affect flavor and the quality of the wine, grapes, climate, weather, soil, and viticulture. Often people don't realize why it is so important to understand the core elements of winemaking. But the ultimate sensation of drinking a poor, good, or great wine begins with these elements. So first, let's take a look at the most important ingredient in wine, the grape. Not all grapes are suited for wine. There are about 60 species of grapevine, but only one specific species, called Vitis vinifera, is used for wine. Vitis vinifera is native to Europe. It was spread throughout the Mediterranean and Europe first by the Phoenicians and the Greeks, and then later by the Romans. In the New World, it was initially spread by Cortez in South America and subsequently to Western North America. Again, when I say New World, everything outside of Europe, because Europe is the Old World. The Dutch took vinifera grapevines to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, and in the early 1600s, the English brought the vines to Australia, then to New Zealand in the 1700s. We'll later learn how each of these different countries, regions, and climates impact the same grapes into their own distinctive wines. Winemakers call the individual grape a berry. And at one point or another, we've all bitten into a table grape, and whether it's white or pink or black grape, you find that the fleshy part is white, despite the color of its skin. The fleshy pulp is where the juice comes from, and the juice itself is always white. Red wine is only red because the winemaker lets the skin sit in the juice and let the color pigmentation, a chemical called anthocyanin, seep in. There are flavors you perceive in wines, ripe fruit to underripe fruit, as well as complex flavors and layers. For example, the grassy tones in Sauvignon Blanc, or even the black pepper spice you get in Syrah or Shiraz. The fleshy part is also where the wine's acidity comes from, which gives the wine its tartness. And we perceive that on the sides of our tongues, if you remember from our last lecture. The acidity in grapes is mostly from tartaric acid. But you also find malic acid, which is the tart acid you find in Granny Smith apples or green apples. We discussed tannin previously as well. Remember, that's the chemical compound in red wine responsible for the bitterness you sense on the back of your tongue and the drying sensation, that tactile sensation you get after you've swallowed the wine. The bitterness comes from the skins of the grapes, the seeds, which are called pips by winemakers, and the stems. Have you ever accidentally bitten into a grape stem while eating a bunch of table grapes? If so, and you recognize how bitter that is, that's tannin. The amount of color and tannin in red wine depends on the thickness of the skins and the size of the berry. For grape varieties with thin skins, such as Pinot Noir, the pigmentation is light, and it's the reason why it's a clear, pale ruby. And if you tilt your glass, you can actually see your fingers through it. It's so pale. However, thick-skinned grapes, such as Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec, and Petit Syrah, have tight clusters and small berries, which make really dark, rich, and opaque wines. You can't even see your fingers through them. We don't concern ourselves too much with the thickness of skins for white wines, except when it comes to sweet wines, which we're going to cover later in Lecture 9. Sugar is another key factor in making wine. Near harvest time, the winemaker will obsessively taste grapes for ripeness to determine the best time to pick for the right amount of sugar, but more about that in the next lecture. All of these elements, sugar and acid and tannin, are the building blocks of quality wine. Each wine has to carefully balance all of these elements to make a wine that you will like. However, there are many factors that affect each of these elements and influence the flavor and quality you get in the glass. Climate is the most influential factor where the grapes are grown. Climate can determine the amount of water a region gets, the temperature during the growing season, the amount of sunlight, and so on. This in turn gives the wine either a stronger and more obvious fruit taste up front, or a more subtle fruit taste with other types of aromas. It can raise or lower acidity, it can raise or lower sugar, and it can affect the ripeness of tannins, which can make the wine supple and soft or astringent. So it's very important to understand climate if you know what your palate profile is, because the climate can help you predict the types of wines that you will like. Wine grapes are roughly concentrated into two bands, in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere, roughly between 30 and 50 degrees latitude. This is where the temperatures, sunshine, and rainfall are ideal. The further from the 30 degree and the closer you get to the 50 degrees north latitude and likewise in south latitude, the cooler the temperature gets. This includes areas such as northern France and Germany in the northern hemisphere and Tasmania and New Zealand in the southern hemisphere. Cool temperatures raise the acidity in the wine and decrease the alcohol. Why? There's an inverse relationship between sugar and acid in a grape. As sugar goes up, the acid comes down. So when the climate is cooler, it's more difficult and it takes longer for the fruit to ripen. So if in this area there is a higher ratio of acidity and relatively lower sugar than in warm climates, there is less sugar and that sugar turns into less alcohol. So that's why cool climates yield wines that are higher in acid and more delicate in body, and also lower in alcohol. So if this fits your palate profile and you gravitate towards wines of this type, then go for wines from a cooler climate. The closer the region is to the 30-degree latitude, such as in California in the northern hemisphere, or Australia, South Africa, South America in the southern hemisphere, getting closer to the equator, the more the fruit takes on a very rich, ripe, and fruity character. This is because there are more hours of sunshine and the temperature is higher. The fruit character that develops is obviously ripe. In tasting, if a wine is very obvious in its ripe fruit, we call that having upfront fruit character. The alcohol tends to be much higher than in cooler climates, and if you are the type that likes full-bodied, high-octane wines with powerful fruit, then you're going to look for wines from a warm climate. Now let's taste the difference. Here we have two wines in front of us, a Chablis, AC, and a South Australian Chardonnay. Now, Chablis is 100% Chardonnay from the northern region in Burgundy, called Chablis, which we will talk about in Lecture 11. The Chardonnay is a New World wine over here from the warmer climate of South Australia. If you couldn't find a wine from South Australia, don't worry about it. If you find something, as long as it's from a warm climate, from a Chardonnay from Spain or Italy or California, that will work as well. Now, we're going to go through our 5 S's that we learned about in Lecture 2. First, we're going to C, our first S. And you're going to pick up your glasses and you're going to put it against a white tablecloth or a white napkin. And when you do this, you're going to look at the color in the core, as we talked about before, versus the rim. Is there a color difference between these two wines? I think you're going to find that the Chablis is a bit paler. That's because it's from a cooler climate. So cooler climate wines yield a paler color. Next, we're going to smell the wine. And again, as we learned in the last lecture, I want you to swirl it to the chest, chin, and nose. Do the same thing with the South Australian Chardonnay. You're going to notice a difference in the aromas in these wines. You're going to notice that in the cooler climate, which is the Chablis, because it's in one of the most northern places you can grow grapes in France, you're going to notice a much more subtle fruit. You're going to have flavors come out like more a mineral tone. Whereas in the South Australian Chardonnay, which comes from a warmer climate, you're going to notice the fruit stands out. It's more upfront and in your face. So in cooler climates, you have less, more subdued fruit, and in warmer climates, it's more obvious. Now we're going to taste the wines. And remember to keep in mind that whole milk analogy that we had, the whole skim milk, whole milk, and heavy cream that we had there on the table. Keep that in mind where you're tasting. That's the Chardonnay. You're going to notice a big difference between the weights of these wines. Because the Chablis comes from a cool climate, it actually has a much more delicate, lighter body, as we spoke about before. And then the South Australian Chardonnay actually feels weightier, almost more towards the heavy cream end of the spectrum. You actually feel that weight while you have it in your mouth, you're holding it on your tongue. So cooler climates have lower body, lower alcohol, but you'll also notice something that it increases. If you remember tasting it, you may have to taste it again. You'll notice on the sides of your tongue, notice that acidity. And it may make your mouth pucker, especially if you go back from the South Australian Chardonnay back over to the Chablis. You'll notice it immediately. So cooler climates also have a higher level of acidity. Now you've just proven to your own palates the difference between, a difference that climate makes on the wine. But altitude also affects the fruit character, acid, and tannin balance of a wine. The higher you go up in altitude, the temperature actually decreases. This also impacts grape berry size. And the reason why we care about this is the whole skin to pulp ratio. Now, those that have a higher skin to pulp ratio are going to be much richer in color, much richer in flavor, and if it's a red wine, much richer in tannin. This is why you hear a lot about mountain fruit in warmer areas such as the Napa Valley, where the fruit on the Napa Valley floor is much more lush and plump and than the denser, more powerful fruit and more tannic fruit, let's say, than in places like Howell Mountain. Another factor that affects climate, regardless of latitude or altitude, is how close the vineyard is to a body of water, which cools an area in the summer but also keeps the temperature warmer in winter. So take, for example, the vineyards of the Mosel around the Rhine River in Germany. Not only does this river reduce frost damage in these vineyards, but the sun reflecting off of the water helps the vines ripen. This is the opposite of wines in regions that are landlocked. This type of climate is called continental. And it has the most important aspect is that it has extreme temperatures. Hot in the summer, really cold in the winter. These are areas like the Central Valley in California or like La Mancha in Spain. Extreme heat can cause too much sugar in the grapes or make them ripen too quickly. And then the flavor will not be as pronounced enough to balance the high alcohol from the high level of sugar. Winemakers also have to be concerned with burnt or unintentionally raisinated grape flavors. All of the patterns we've discussed up until this point are typical patterns one can expect within a region. However, within one specific year, weather patterns can create heavenly conditions or wreak havoc, reducing the quality of the harvest or even destroying it altogether. Before we get there, however, we have to take a look at how a grapevine grows. Now, to do that, let's go to an organic vineyard. You should note that Jonah's giving an average yield here. The amount of wine per vine is going to change as the vine ages. The younger the vine, the higher the yield. The older the vine, the lower the yield, and in some cases, half as much. But the wine gets better and better as the vines age, so it's worth the lower yield. Jonah mentioned that they were about to begin pruning in February. Late winter is a delicate time at vineyards, as after pruning, the vines are the most vulnerable to frost. Frost can not only kill the buds, where next year's growth is being collected and will shoot from, but when it's really bad, it's called black frost, which turns the growing shoots of the vines into powder. This actually happened in France in 1991, nearly wiping out the Bordeaux harvest, and in Northern California in 2008, affecting an estimated 70% of the harvest. Then the vines start to come alive in April or May, or October and November in the Southern Hemisphere. And this is when the bud break happens. Foliage, leaves and shoots, start to come out, and then flowers start to form. This is where the vines are particularly vulnerable to hail and frost. For example, in 2009 in Bordeaux, hail, some of it the size of ping pong balls, wiped out a good portion of many of the vineyards. For example, Château Soutard suffered damage about 95% of their vineyards, and at least 2/3 of Château Palmer's vineyards were damaged. Why do we care about frost and hail? Well, for one, it dramatically reduces supply, so we may not get the wine we want that year, and it can also raise prices substantially. In June, the caps come off the flowers and the pollination and the fertilization take place. While not the prettiest of horticultural gems, the flower does have a slight scent to it. I was in Champagne one year and I could smell the delicate scent of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier flowers. Then we get to berry formation. As the berries get larger, sometime about August or January in the Southern Hemisphere, can't forget about them, veraison occurs. Veraison is the French word for the process of where the grape berry is beginning to turn from, let's say, green to red. So it's ripening, so veraison. Then in late summer or fall, grape harvesting begins. The whole process from bud break to harvest is approximately 4 to 5 months in warm climates and about 6 to 7 in cool climates. This is more complicated than it sounds. Let's travel back to Napa Valley. It's time to go to Robert Mondavi Winery to see why. We'll be talking to the director of winemaking, Geneviève Janssens. So we have different grape varieties here. We have Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. Do you pick them all at the same time?
No, not at all, because the maturity is very different. Every variety will mature at a different speed. In August, we harvest Sauvignon Blanc. Beginning September, Pinot Noir. Then the Chardonnay start to be picked. The Chardonnay is a very interesting variety because it's one of the longest to be picked. Then the Merlot, and the Merlot, because very sensitive of the weather and temperature, can be fast or it can be slow depending on the weather. And then Cabernet Sauvignon. So that's how it's unfold during harvest.
Now, Geneviève just talked about varying the harvest according to the type of grape. But weather can also have an impact on wine, especially rain, which can dilute flavor. Let's see what Geneviève can tell us about this. So what happens when it rains during harvest, and how does that impact what you have inside the resulting wine and inside everybody's glass?
If it is a Chardonnay vineyard, we are in trouble because Chardonnay has a very thin skin and mold can grow very quickly. So that's where the winemakers must take decision. If it is close to harvest, we harvest the fruit. We don't let it hang because the fruit will be good anyway. But if it is very green, we have to pay attention, and as soon as we see mold, we ask the viticulturist to drop the cluster because it kills the fruit. If it is Cabernet Sauvignon, it's a very thick variety. It's very tough for rain, and it can go through a lot of rain before it is not good. So we can let it hang and stay outside if the date of harvest is very far away. Or if it is close, we can leave it there for a while, wait for the sun, and then harvest when the sun is back. So it's a lot of complex decision, and again, that's why we need to know the weather.
We'll talk more with Geneviève about the precarious dance between weather and harvest in the next lecture. But you may have guessed that vintages from cooler climates are more susceptible to unexpected changes. This generally means that they are less consistent year on year, and the flavors can be dramatically affected. This is why vineyards in Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Champagne, making some of the most expensive wines in the world, they make such a big deal out of the timing of their harvests. We'll be mentioning some of great and poor vintages, that is, wine grown in a specific year, in the upcoming lectures. But it also means that you should be paying close attention when we mention them from cooler climates, especially in lectures 7, 10, and 11. It could very well help you find a great wine or a great deal. Let's talk about soil now, since soil makes up the difference in a vine's ability to bring up water and nutrients, which can affect how the vine functions and therefore quality and flavor. The soils you see around the world are widely varied in color, textures, and nutrients. Take, for example, the red Terra Rossa soil of Coonawarra in Australia, or the white limestone chalk of Champagne in France, or the blue slate of the Mosel in Germany, to the Licorella soil in Priorat in Spain, which actually looks like tiger skin. All of these soil types affect vine health and wine quality. You may have gone to a wine class or two, or perhaps you've heard at a cocktail party something like, "Oh yes, this wine tastes the way it does because of the terroir." The idea of terroir, this special word, refers to the influences that give a wine a sense of place, meaning that when you taste the wine's characteristics identify it as something only coming from that area. Although soil is a component of terroir, it is a much bigger concept. We'll be getting into the various soils and how they affect the vine within each of the lectures of the regions. But first, we should understand better why soil and terroir are so important.
To the juice, to the sugars, the acids, the minerals, the proteins, the compounds, All of that came from only one place, the soil. Because we farm organically, we have no need for extra.
Obviously, not all winemakers agree with Jonah that wine growing should be organic, and you may want to try a Frog's Leap wine, such as their Zinfandel, and compare it to another Zinfandel that's not from an organic vineyard. See if you can discern any differences yourself. At any rate, between Jonah and Geneviève, you can probably understand why I said winemakers have an almost mystic connection to their land and their vines. But you've begun to taste that for yourselves in this lecture. In the next lecture, you'll need 2 whites, a Saint-Supéry, or Saint-Supéry Sauvignon Blanc, and a Robert Mondavi Fumé Blanc. These are whites, but you'll also need 2 reds, a Crianza from Rioja, or here we have a Reserva, and then a Rioja Gran Reserva. These wines will help you to understand the impact that man has on wine versus Mother Nature, which we talked about in this lecture. Understanding these relationships among all the elements of growing and making wine will help you understand why you get the flavors that you do. Until then, cheers.